Already, certainly, I can talk about at our company, we're moving towards more of an HTML-based proofing process, where you're making sure the content is right, and then it'll be fed into any number of different ways. But I think it's a very good question, but so far I'm not aware of any. And I don't see anyone rushing to correct me. So, good. Any other questions at this point? Okay, so now we're going to publish. And this is actually very relevant to what you just asked. Because now, when you think about publication, you're all of a sudden going out in all sorts of different formats. Not just print, electronic, you've got mobile. Even electronic isn't necessarily so simple. You've got your PDF, you've got your HTML version, you might be on multiple platforms, it might render slightly differently. That's why proofing that content is really the most important part. But this is also where probably the part that's most susceptible to issues with electronic rendering are tables. Because figures, they're going to render in a certain way. You can ideally just download the source file. You can access that source file. Text usually is fairly reliable, except maybe it's got annoying line breaks occasionally. But tables are the ones that get most disrupted. So you really want to make sure that you're creating tables that are as clear, simple as possible, spending the time on the proofing to make sure that everything is aligned in the way that you would want. Because sometimes that does happen during the proofing process as someone collapses a column into another or tries to merge things that don't belong, or just the shading that a journal uses might be confusing. So making sure that you've thought about that. Once it's been published, as we talked about earlier, archiving is extremely important. So now we're going to move on to author rights, which is, I think, probably one of the more misunderstood aspects of publishing. So again, please do feel free to ask questions as we go. Copyright. So the basic idea is that the author, in some cases their institution, depending on the arrangement, has the right under national copyright laws and international treaties to control how the works are to be used and distributed by others. No one can do anything with that paper you created until you've given them permission. The extent of copyright rights include allowing authors to permit copying, distribution, online access, translation, creation of derivative works. Why does this matter to publishing? Publishers cannot publish an article unless they're granted the right to do so. So usually you'll be asked to provide some paperwork at some point during the process. Often it'll be the corresponding author on behalf of other authors. Sometimes it'll be each individual author. That has some variation from journal to journal. There's two different flavors. In subscription journals, it's more traditional to ask the author to transfer the copyright to the publisher. Not all journals do this. Some just ask you to do the second version, which is licensing. You retain the copyright, but you give the publisher the express permission to publish the article, and it usually involves some other rights carried across. These are legal documents, and you should always read them and not just treat them like those terms and agreements that you just click through. And I actually just did that earlier this morning and then immediately felt hypocritical for doing so. Always make sure you know what you're reading, what you're signing off on. Then is the time to ask questions. Right? And this is where, again, librarians can be a good resource because they've probably seen any number of these things over the years. They probably have experience. They know what's kind of normal looking, what's not. They also might have some ideas if you have specific concerns about how you might approach that. Even if you've signed a transfer of copyright, under fair use clauses and different publisher policies, you will retain a number of rights. So it's not like you are handing over ownership of your paper and now you can't do anything with it ever again. These vary significantly. This sample is taken from Elsevier's policies. It's just a sampling of things that are not given away. Teaching and making copies of the article for use in classroom teaching, sharing it with research colleagues, expanding it and using it in compilations, your thesis, your dissertation, we get a lot of those requests. We consider that automatically part of the author rights. Use in educational materials, handing it out at a conference if you present on the research, and then patent and trademark rights not affected. There's a site called howcanishare.com, which is a publisher agnostic site, which provides more information and tries to make this whole process a lot easier. But basically, the idea is that it's your work, you created it, and there's no reason to stand in the way of scholarly communication, scholarly sharing. what you will find, and this is why I talked about the versions of an article earlier, is that the later you get in the process, the more involvement that publishing staff have had on a paper, that tends to be where they tend to get a little bit more strict about some of these rights discussions. A preprint pretty much can be shared with anyone at any time. It's up to you to define those terms. Once you get to the final published version of an article, where it's got the journal branding, the typesetting's been done, the copy editing's been done, it's been gone through the whole review process and been approved, that's where you start to see a little bit more tightening, because the idea is that you don't want to enable a situation where basically a journal can be created wholesale or recreated wholesale somewhere else. Right? That's really what the concern is there. So if you have any questions, again, librarians are great resources here because there is such variation, and they can probably help you disentangle it. But it also segues nicely into the discussion of open access. So open access, you're going to hear talk about two basic models, green and gold. And gold is free public access to the final published article immediately and permanently upon publication. In a lot of cases, there's a fee. So again, this is one of those things that you want to look for in that instructions for authors. We get a lot of cases where you submit to a paper not realizing that it's an open access journal, and all of a sudden you get that invoice saying, hey, don't forget to pay, and you think, what? I didn't sign up for this? Or at least this is, again, the version we hear. Realistically, hopefully you've been asked about it a few times along the way, but just be aware of that. The usage by an end user is determined by the license you sign. We'll talk about that in just a second. There's a few different approaches. There's journals that are entirely open access. There is what are called hybrid journals, which publish some subscription content, but if you pay a fee, then that article will be made open access. So there's a few different approaches there. You always want to make sure you've checked any requirements of your institution or your funding body regarding many aspects of open access. Posting in an institutional repository. I understand Albany Medical College doesn't have one. If you're at a different institution, though, just be mindful of that. If your funder has any expectations, make sure you know what those are, because what we tend to get is a lot of emails round about grant submission time where people realize that they didn't check all the boxes when they submitted their work on their previous grant, and now they're being asked to provide documentation that they don't have. So make sure you've thought about that up front. Now, because there is that fee, this can seem deterring. This is great. I don't have the funding to use for that. How can I still participate in open access? How can I still publish open access? That's where green open access comes in. Green open access says free public access to a version of your article. Probably the version of green you're most familiar with would be PubMed Central, where any NIH-sponsored paper, the accepted version is made available no more than 12 months following publication. And usually publishers do this on authors' behalf. That policy has evolved over time. Originally, authors only could do it, but the compliance rates were really low. And then a lot of publishers started taking this on, and that's made it a lot easier. But some publishers do still expect the authors to do it. So just be aware of that going in and make sure you're clear about what to expect there. That's where I get all those emails. Where's my PMC ID? Well, you didn't mark the paper as NIH sponsored. Somehow left that out of the paper. So make sure you've declared your funding. Make sure you've complied appropriately. Now the trade-off, because there's no fee involved, is that there is often that embargo period. That's the idea, is that then the period before embargo is used for the recouping of costs by the journal, but that you don't have to pay anything additional. This is why the NIH has traditionally kind of liked this approach. There's no additional money necessarily going into the system. There are a few other types of open access, sponsored open access, sometimes called diamond open access. You could get a society, an institution that subsidizes, right? And makes it free for authors, free for readers, because they're covering all the costs. The costs are always covered somewhere along the way. User licenses, especially with open access articles, sometimes with other types of articles, you might be asked to select a user license. And these tend to have complicated abbreviations like CC BY 4.0, CC BY NC ND. These all mean different things. Basically, CC is Creative Commons. The NC there is non-commercial, ND being non-derivative. So what this does is this says, I don't need to have someone ask my permission as long as people stick within these frameworks. The non-commercial application, for example, means you can do things with my paper as long as you're not going to make money off of them. If you aren't going to make money off of them, I need to be asked. Someone needs to come to me and ask my permission. The non-derivatives says, if you're going to reuse my paper, it has to be in its entirety as it is. You can't do any crazy remixing, cutting and pasting sort of approach. What's important is that pretty much all of the licenses, except for the very, very most liberal, are going to require attribution at all points. So just because you're assigning to say someone can do these things doesn't mean you're not going to get credit for it. They should still be citing the article. And also important for people who don't have the funding but still want to make sure that their work is getting used in appropriate ways, is getting disseminated in appropriate ways, is the Research for Life collaboration. The relevant one for our group would be HINARI, the Health Internetwork Access to Research Initiative, which provides free or low-cost access to thousands of peer-reviewed journals to public institutions in over 100 developing countries. So even if you're publishing in a traditional subscription journal, most major publishers are participating in one of these initiatives to make sure that those articles are available through the World Health Organization. Any questions on open access before we move to our final section? Okay. So getting your paper noticed. You've just published your article. Congratulations. Currently, as of 2013, there are almost 40 million articles available somewhere online. The number of new papers per year is quite large. Elsevier itself publishes some 400,000, and we are one of about 5,000 different publishers. So there's a lot of research being published every year. The average time spent on reading that literature is 7 hours per week, which is at once a lot of time and also not a lot of time. So how do you make sure that your paper is not falling through the cracks? Because according to one study, this one from Learned Publishing 2012, 40% of researchers surveyed said they had actually not read the whole article for the last important article that they'd read. Time is a precious resource. Time is a finite resource. So how do we balance this? There are things that you can do to help make your paper rise in people's attention. This starts when you're preparing your article, spending time on that abstract and conclusion and references. The abstract and conclusion, because these are the things that people are going to read. Even if you've got a paper that you're publishing subscription, paper that you're publishing open access, it's still going to be that abstract that more people are going to read than not. We talked about that earlier. The references, because that's where the linking comes in, right? If you've got one paper citing out to another, the internet loves links. It loves these connections. And so being able to think carefully about those links can really help you. Sharing your research data, if appropriate, and linking to it in your article. The article is one version of research output. It doesn't have to be the only research output to come from a study. There are many different ways of approaching this. Be very careful with medical data, but there are ways of sharing this information in different ways. Using easy to understand charts and professional looking illustrations. If anything, our society is moving more and more to graphics and less to text. This is painful for me. I'm one of those people who doesn't like to watch the video. I like to read the article. But realistically, more and more people are looking for those catchy images. We rolled out graphical abstracts a few years ago, and they pop up next to people in the next articles and search results. And there really has been a statistically significant effect on people clicking through because that image will grab your attention. Certainly with Twitter, there's all sorts of research showing that if you include a graphic in Twitter, it makes people more likely to interact. Make sure that you've used clear and correct manuscript language, and choosing the right journal is a good place to start. Because for a lot of people, it is a filter. It is one way of choosing from those search results where they're going to start. There's a lot of stuff that's done behind the scenes to do with search engine optimization to hopefully make that stand out. Things that you can do on the author side means making sure that your key terms are included in your title. Again, this is where those jokey titles can sometimes backfire against you because you're not using the terms you want people to search on. Abstracts, highly searchable. Make sure those terms are in there carefully. Don't be afraid to promote your own work. You can't just sit around and wait for someone else to do it. You can start the conversation too. Don't be afraid to network at conferences. And I'm not advocating sitting there just talking to people about nothing about what you're doing, but thinking about ways to network strategically, to share with people what you're excited about, what you're working on. And online too. If you have a media-worthy article, something you think is going to have significant public interest, get to know your media relations team. And I'm sure Albany Medical College has a very good one. Talk to them. See what kinds of things they look for. What kind of research do they like to know about? Because they try to stay on top of everything coming out of their own institutions, but they especially like things that are new and just coming out. So if you can let them know about something exciting you've got on the way, it helps them. Social media, we talked earlier about the one mention of a scholarly article every 7 seconds. Be mindful that the tweet is the message. According to a 2016 study in ACM Sigmetrics, 59% of shared URLs are never clicked on. People are basically taking the message of that tweet, and that becomes the message of your article for many of them. So think carefully about that. If you're tweeting out your whole title, now that they've expanded the character limit, that can be helpful. But think about whether there's a better way of saying it in a concise way. Social collaboration networks, Mendeley, ResearchGate, academia.edu, good way to profile yourself, profile your research. Now, when I talked earlier about being careful about sharing the final published version of your article, this is one area where sometimes people get caught up because the idea is that you, in most cases, unless it's an open access journal, would not be sharing the final published version of your article publicly. If it's to a small group, to a defined network, that can be different, but if you're sharing it publicly, you probably don't want to have that final published version. Tips for effective outreach. You want to make sure you keep it short, accurate, and relevant. Make it easy to find out more. As a new parent a few years ago, I would always read about this exciting new research, and they'd highlight it in parenting magazines. They wouldn't tell me who did the research. They wouldn't tell me what journal it was published in. They would just describe the result in terms that, to be honest, I was taking on face value, but it was the journalist's interpretation. So make it easy. Anytime you're talking about your work, how do they reach you? How do they find the published version of the article? Understand that even if you're careful, your work may still be misrepresented. Because again, many people react without reading an article with their own agenda. There was this great article on NPR's website back in 2014, Why Doesn't America Read Anymore? Oh, people got really mad about this one. It's the decline of society, it's the end of the world as we know it, people should read more. And then you look at the date, which is hidden in the URL up there, April 1st. Because if you click through on that link, it takes you to a little stub that says, we noticed some people were reacting to our articles without having giving signs that they actually read them. We were curious to see if that would happen here. And it did. Understand that journalists are very well aware that compelling headlines attract more readers. They want to make it sensational. They want to make it exciting. Anytime there's public communication of science, you have to worry about certain common misunderstandings or misrepresentations. Sample size, p-value, causality, other variables. This wonderful BMJ article looked at press releases and found that 40% of those included exaggerated advice, 33% exaggerated causal claims, and 36% exaggerated inference to humans from animal research. I think this goes back to the question earlier. In your title, do you include whether this is an animal study, human study, et cetera? When news articles were based on those releases, those percentages just increased and compared to the control group. It's like the game of telephone, right? Where you start with a message on that side and you whisper it across to someone, and by the time it gets to the other side of the room, it's very little relation to what you started with. So just be mindful in any of your communication, you can control that original message, but after that, it's on its own. And the nice thing about this is there's all sorts of new ways to monitor your article, provide article level metrics. You've probably run into Altmetric at this point, which tracks social media usage, amongst others. Plum Analytics does the same thing. Looking at different sources, the idea is that we're not limited to just tracking citations anymore. We can track so much more about the impact of an article and the impact of research. So I've included some further reading here. The Researcher Academy link to there has a whole bunch of videos and workshops and presentations that you can go through at your own leisure about the research journey, about publishing in general, all free. And my email address is included on that title slide as well as right there. So I will ask the panel if they have any final words of wisdom to impart to us before opening it up to any more questions. No? All right, wonderful. Then I will open it to the group for any questions that you would like to ask. Stunned silence. Thank you.
So thank you, George, very much. You gave us a lot to think about. Certainly you can contact George with any questions or stop into the library, see any of the librarians. You know where to find us. Thank you for coming.